Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again. Today, I have a very special guest, an old friend and a current colleague of mine, Mr. Darren Jones. Thank you, Darren.
Hi. Hi. Nice to be here.
All right. So, give you a little bit of background on Darren. Darren has a BA in philosophy with a writing minor from Georgia Southern University. That's where we met. Took a couple of undergraduate classes together. Shout out to Dr. Eaton. Darren also has a MA in philosophy from San Francisco State, and he is currently a PhD candidate in philosophy at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Darren's philosophical interest, logic, ethics, political philosophy, ancient philosophy, American philosophy. His personal interest, of course, this is where Darren and I have bonded, anime and gaming. But today we're going to talk about some of these philosophical interests. Later on down the road, Darren and I are going to do some philosophy of anime videos, so be on the lookout for that. So Darren, let's start big picture, general question here, an impossibly simple question. What is ethics?
Ethics, the study of right and wrong. One of the most concrete areas of philosophy. When you talk about things like metaphysics or monads, phenomenology, the layperson, the non-academic, they don't really understand the connection to their lives, or not usually, but ethics, they almost always do. Laws, international laws, things like that, moral systems within the individual. So ethics is one of the most concrete areas of philosophy where people really understand how it affects their lives, why it's important, and that makes it one of my favorite areas of philosophy for that reason.
Darren, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, and I forgot to mention, Darren, you've been teaching for a better part of a decade now, is that correct?
About that, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've encountered this. I encounter this just about every time I teach ethics, but can you talk for a second about how we study / learn about ethics within the context of philosophy versus kind of the common use of the term and what that kind of difference looks like?
Oh, yeah, very good. There's the ethics and morality distinction. How do we learn ethics in a philosophical context, and then how do we learn ethics outside of that? Well, in the philosophical context, at least where I've been taught, and this is in the more Western traditions, although I have been exposed to Eastern as well, we use argumentation, logic, deduction, induction, more induction than deduction. And we try to make appeals to, say, evidence and happy mental states. We try to do anything except, say, just appeal to authority or God, which is how most non-philosophers do it. Typically, a person who hasn't been trained in philosophy will be exposed to ethics through their church, their parents, first of all, and through their church. And both of those are appeal to authority type justifications for those ethical systems. You do it because your parents told you to do it, or you do it because the church told you that God told them, these are the rules, and it's based on authority. Whereas ethics done philosophically, and there's lots of different ways to try to justify an ethical system, and some people even say that there are no justifications and it's all relative, so that in and of itself is an argument. But trying to ground ethical claims in evidence and reason would be the philosophical way to do it, the way that I would like to try to do it. Even if that is, for some people would say that's wrong-headed and impossible anyway. But I still would like to try it that way.
Yeah. I like that dichotomy that you drew there. And you mentioned some what might be some technical words to some people. So I'm going to ask you to elaborate and expand on this distinction between deductive reasoning and because I know you like logic, deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning versus like common, for lack of a better word, street reasoning. I don't know if that's a term, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. Street smarts, yeah, common sense. Yeah, so deduction and induction. Deduction and induction, and the way I would teach this in class, deduction starts with D, and so does the word definitely. So deductive arguments are definite arguments. If you have 2 apples, and then I give you 3 more apples, then you have 5 apples. If everything we said is true, then the conclusion follows definitely. 2 plus 3 equals 5. On the other hand, if apples are some of your favorite things to eat for lunch, and I was to guess what you're going to eat for lunch tomorrow, there's a high chance that you're going to have an apple because I know Mike loves apples for lunch, but it's not definite. You might have run out of apples. You might not be feeling like having an apple that day. Maybe you want an orange or a pear or something else, right? That's an inductive argument. Like if I say there's a high probability that it's going to rain tomorrow, right? That's inductive. It might happen. There's a high chance that it will, but it's not definite like 2 plus 3 equals 5. And so how that relates to ethics, we might say something like people living in peace and harmony is an objectively good state. If you follow ethical plan X, you will get to that good state. Therefore, we should follow ethical plan X, right? That would be a deductive argument, but unfortunately in the real world, things don't happen that way. Some would argue that state X is not ideal. They might say that that's not a good way to be, or they might say that that plan A to get to state X, I'm getting a little confused there myself, but the following a particular ethical plan might not actually get us there. So that would be more like an inductive argument. We're talking about probabilities. So anyway, to bring it back to where we were at the start, deductive arguments follow definitely, inductive arguments follow indefinitely. There's only a probability that it might happen. And unfortunately, in the real world, we mostly deal with inductive arguments that are much more prevalent than deductive arguments. Most things only have a probability of happening. Outside of, say, like mathematics or something like that, the vast majority of argument, the entire apparatus of science is a big inductive argument, you know? We know gravity works this way because we've observed it this many times before. We assume it's going to happen that way next week, right? That's an inductive argument. And so most ethical arguments are more inductive than deductive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Can you speak a little bit? Oftentimes when I introduced ethics, there seems to be this understanding for people that haven't studied philosophy that it's almost like it's not even worth talking about ethics because ethics is just simply a matter of opinion, right? I think there's a lot of an assumption here about what we would call like moral relativism.
Right.
Right. So can you talk about moral relativism in the context of philosophy and maybe a little bit about how ethical reasoning takes place, or like maybe what a good ethical argument would look like to kind of show people the sort of arguments that philosophers put forward within the context of ethics?
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, yeah, even if people try to act like it's all a matter of opinion, in a democracy, those opinions, whether you choose to engage in them or not, or think about them or not, are going to affect your life. We've decided in this society that murder, homicide is wrong and you will be punished for that. And if you decided not to think about it, okay, but you better not engage in that behavior because this society is going to put you in jail or worse. And so in a way, you're kind of forced to think about it in a democracy, or, you know, we live in a society. I was tempted to say that. So you kind of have to. It's like the moving train quote. I set some of it down and said, I'm sure somebody more profound than them said it, but it's impossible to be neutral on a moving train. And so, you know, the society is making laws based on ethics all around you. So if you choose not to think about it, it's still going to affect your life. And we do actually engage. The whole process of voting is us bringing our own sort of conclusions to bear. If I believe that, say, abortion is healthcare is bodily autonomy and should be allowed, and I vote with that in mind, I'm sort of putting my ethical argument into action, trying to affect the world. If I believe the opposite, that abortion is murder, that it should not be allowed under any circumstance, under very limited circumstances, and I go out and vote with that in mind, I'm putting my ethical argument out into the world. So if you're not doing it, trust me, everybody else around you is doing it, and it's kind of almost impossible to not think about. When it comes to ethical relativism, this is where it gets a little tricky. We don't want to slip up and become myopic. We don't want to be insular and, just to put it plainly, racist. We don't want to say our system and our society is better than everybody else's. There are clear differences, though. In some Middle Eastern countries, the example I use is when you're caught thieving, they might chop your hand off. And this also comes from Aladdin. It's really bad getting your cultural your cultural knowledge from Disney movies, from Aladdin and all that. But that's, hey, I'm American. That's how important kind of was. But no, it's we'll cut off your hand. In America, that's cruel and unusual punishment. So what is it? Are they unenlightened barbarians, and we are the enlightened ones because we have a provision against cruel and unusual punishment? Or is it, that would be the sort of objectivist stance, that we have the objectively better ethical standards? Or the relativist stance would be, well, they have their way of doing it based on their traditions. We have our way of doing it. And if you try to take an objectivist stance, you're actually just being bigoted. You're just saying those evil people over there while we are the exceptional ones over here. And I think that's what sort of makes relativism attractive and intriguing. And I personally, I kind of look both ways on that. My feeling on it, though, would be, if we could go back to, say, justifying an ethical system by appealing to evidence and logic, and what would be an example of a good ethical argument would be, say, country A has this much happiness. And we know this because we took a poll, we asked people, how happy are you? Country B has less happiness. And therefore, since country B has less happiness, their ethical system must be inferior, right? There could be a million different reasons why they have less happiness, have nothing to do with their ethical system. But in general, that's how I would do it. If you're living in a country that oppresses homosexuals, that oppresses minorities, that oppresses women, you're going to find that that country is going to be less happy than the country that doesn't. Since we agree that happiness, hopefully we agree that happiness is a worthy goal, and it's kind of getting into utilitarianism. But if we agree that happiness is a worthy goal here, then we should adopt the ethical system that leads us to the most happiness. And that's a more objective way of looking at it. And I think that's probably amongst the better ethical arguments. I also look at things like mortality rate. Which country has more people dying? Which country has more people, unhappy? And that's probably some of the closest way to get to like a good ethical argument.
Okay. And so to build off what you just, a term that you just used there, you brought up utilitarianism. So let's talk about the big kind of classic historical ethical theories. Would you mind outlining those for us, and then maybe we can move through some of them?
Sure. Wow. Okay. That's a good one. So we talked about appeal to authority, and that's kind of, I feel like that's one of the weakest ones, because while it doesn't mean that's definitely wrong, it's always going to lead you to the wrong answer. It seems like it requires the least amount of introspection and thinking. Someone just says, this is the rule, and you're going to do it because if you don't, I'm going to hit you, or something like that. And, that's one way of going about it. Then you've got sort of the big two, deontological and utilitarianism. Deontological arguments by Kant, and utilitarian arguments, I would go with Bentham or John Stuart Mill. Now, starting with utilitarianism, from the root word utility, which means a good. So you can look at it as goodism. Utilitarianism says that whatever action produces the most amount of happiness and the least amount of pain, the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain, this is the ethically correct answer. Deontological, or you might call it Kantian ethics, going back to Immanuel Kant, he says that no, deontological ethics are duty-based ethics, and that's actually where ethical goodness comes from. It's from doing your duty, not worrying about the effects within the world. These are things that are beyond your scope anyway. You can't actually calculate future outcomes to that degree of accuracy and that far into the future. So you can't actually do utilitarianism. And so you're much better off just doing your duty and not worrying about the effects, because the effects aren't your responsibility in the first place. So utilitarianism and deontological ethics are often put against each other because they seem to clash. I would put them at the top two theories. And then you've got a couple more. You've got virtue ethics with Aristotle, and this goes back to ancient Greeks with Aristotle, who says that good ethical behavior is learned, but it's a matter of learning to have the right dispositions in the right proportions. Not say anger, for example. It's not just that you should never be angry, but that you have the golden mean between no anger and excessive anger is just sort of a reasonable amount, So that's virtue ethics. Then you've got people like Ayn Rand who posits stuff like egoism, that selfishness, that everyone looking after themselves will lead to a prospering society. I want to become rich, so I sell hot dogs. You want hot dogs. You think they're delicious. So you win and I win. I don't actually care about you, but your stomach is full and you pay, and you don't care about me. You just want to eat, but we both get what we want, and we're both just looking out for ourselves, right? That I don't put that in a higher tier, but that's sort of a Randian ethic. And then there's more besides that. If you go Eastern, you can get sort of a Confucius, knowing your place within society sort of ethic, and we can go all the way down the line. But yes, going back to where we started, utilitarianism says whatever creates the most amount of happiness is the right action, and you can contrast that directly against Kantian deontological ethics, which says you can't make that calculation, so just do your duty, and then whatever your duty is, that's a whole nother argument there. But yeah, that's utilitarianism.
So maybe let's, for the time being, let's stick with deontological and utilitarianism. I'd like to kind of explore what these two theories kind of look like when applied to a situation. The situation that students usually go straight to for whatever reason is murder. So maybe we can start there. So this is, I guess, what would be called like applied ethics when you're looking at a particular ethical situation. And what Darren was outlining before would be considered metaethics, where you're big picture ethical theories. So let's bring them together here. So and you could feel free to frame this situation however you want to, but let's go with the example of murder and perhaps look at that example through both of those theories.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let me think. Okay, so utilitarianism, murder. All right. So if we're talking about something as clear as it can be, as murder, as stark, I should say, as murder, and I use this particular thought experiment, and I call it the magic city thought experiment. And we could adapt it to use murder here. But let's say, and I'm trying to be even quicker than my first take here. Let's say you're the president of America, and a wizard approaches you and says, I guarantee you America will have 10,000 years of prosperity and happiness. All the good things in the world will happen for the total population, 300 million. And all you got to do is just murder one person. You know, the utilitarian says the correct answer is obvious. You would be morally wrong to not murder this person because you're talking about, you know, how many more deaths are you going to have over the next 10,000 years over the population of America if you don't do this? So if you're concerned about death, we all agree that death is wrong, but we can also agree that 1,000 deaths is worse than one death, you know? And so for the utilitarian, it seems like the answer is quite cut and dry. And you might say, well, that's a magical situation. Thought experiments are not worthwhile. That doesn't matter. Well, what if I said, well, you're a judge and you've got a client in front of you that's part of a hated minority, and you know that they're innocent, but if you don't convict them of this crime that will ultimately lead to their death, then the city is going to riot because everybody's racist. Everyone hates that person anyway. And so you might think as a utilitarian, well, I know they're innocent, but if I don't do this, then there's going to be worse effects down the line. And so a utilitarian might conclude under those circumstances that the correct answer is to kill the person that they know is innocent, but that's the morally correct answer. And we could replicate this across a lot of real world scenarios, say with drone warfare. I know that my bomb is going to kill 10 innocent civilians, but I also know that I'm going to get 2 terrorists. And those 2 terrorists were planning on killing people down the line. So those 10 civilians, the collateral damage, a utilitarian says, is the morally right thing to do. And so what you'll find is that in a lot of fiction, the bad guy is often, in order to make a compelling bad guy, a person who thinks they're doing the right thing, you often make them a utilitarian. And spoiler warning for a couple of different IPs here, but the Watchman, Ozymandias is a utilitarian. He's killed millions to save billions in his mind. Thanos is a utilitarian. He sees what he's doing as the morally right action. The people trying to stop him, they're the ones that are wrong. The good villain is the hero of their own story. This also comes across in Naruto. Obito, Madara, they're doing what they're doing because they think that that's going to bring about a better world.
Itachi.
And so you see how utilitarians can, under certain circumstances, justify murder. Now, there's 2 different. The utilitarian was aware of this dilemma, and they tried to. There are a couple other dilemmas with utilitarianism as well. Should we all just be blissed out on heroin addiction? We'd all be happy. If everybody was addicted to heroin, would that be a better world? There are all sorts of problems with that. So you have these different variations of utilitarianism: act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says just look at that particular action in and of itself, whereas rule utilitarianism goes a bit deeper and would say, well, imagine if that were the rule. If it's okay for you to commit a murder because you think it's going to bring about a better effect, then it would also be okay for everyone else to do that. What if other people were mistaken? Or what if everybody decided to do that? Well, then we're no better off. Everybody's committing murder. So rule utilitarianism is kind of a variation that tries to address that problem. And then I don't know if you want me to go on and talk about murder in the deontological. Okay, yeah. So the flip side of utilitarianism is deontological, which starts with the letter D, and that still does the word duty. Duty-based ethics there. Deontological ethics would go the other way. If you were to encounter you walk into a room, and in that room is a murderer holding a gun to someone else's head, and you have the opportunity to pull out your gun and shoot the murderer, you would think that's the correct action. I mean, you might be, I don't think we would even call that murder if it was done in defense of someone else, but let's just for the sake of argument say that it is. the deontological arguer, Kant, he might say that you were wrong for doing that because now you've committed a murder, right? If you would just let the situation play out, that your hands are clean. Now, some people say that through inaction, your hands are not clean. So there's another argument there. But what we're saying here for Kant, for a deontological thinker, you aren't responsible for anything other than your own actions. When you pull out your gun to shoot the murderer, you have now taken a life. You have now committed murder. Your soul is now tainted. I think this is the same thing with the Nazi at the door example. You're not allowed to lie to save the Jewish people hiding in your basement. It's all sorts of little weird rules there. Maybe you can say nothing or whatever, but that's where the sort of opposite stance sort of runs into problems too, where they say, well, even under extreme circumstances where it seems like killing is justified, you're better off not doing it because the world belongs to God. The world, that everything that happens outside of your actions, you're not responsible for that. It's the trolley problem all over again, and so, yeah, because you run into problems when you go all in on utilitarianism, and you run into problems when you go all in on the opposite of that. Even though this is hokey, and I hate when this is just trotted out, the right answer is always in between or whatever. But in this particular case, I think, say like the John Rawls who sort of did more ethics more recently. I think of Rawls, people like Chomsky and things like that. They always have elements of both. Elements of utilitarianism, but also certain duties, certain lines that must never be crossed. And when you combine them in that way, you get a more coherent and a more, attractive ethical system. One that I think sort of fits the way Americans think in general,
So, yeah, I was going to ask you if maybe there's a sort of middle ground between the two. I want to shift gears a little bit here to touch upon an idea that you brought up in your explanations for both of these. And that's the connection between, and I think oftentimes this connection isn't presented, well, I can't say that's not presented in the way it should be. I don't think it's emphasized enough. And that's the connection between ethics and political philosophy. So you mentioned before about acting in a democracy and how our ethical decisions to do or to not do something carry political weight. Can you elaborate more on that connection?
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I love to teach it and I love to study it, because when you're standing in front of a classroom and you want to make it concrete, ethics is, people love metaphysics, they love talking about that kind of stuff, but they walk away from it thinking like the answer doesn't really matter. But in ethics, they feel like the answers do matter. In a democracy or in any type of political system, we make these choices that are reflections of our ethical arguments. I don't think we can even avoid doing that, or even the avoiding of doing it is in itself a sort of argument. But it also, if you follow your ethics, you're going to end up engaging in political action almost necessarily. If you really take your ethics seriously, if you take your philosophy seriously, if you start thinking of ethical arguments and you really believe them, I don't see how you go back to just watching TV all day. Sure, you're gonna watch some TV, of course, but I don't see how you just go back to all day doing that and not donating to particular charities or going to particular rallies or voting for particular candidates. If you really take your ethics seriously, you're going to end up doing that. And it's really hard for me to divorce the two. And when I did my master's dissertation, it was on the death of Socrates and how his ethics ran against the politics of that day, and how through Socrates' life, there are various examples of him engaging in ethical action, political action. For him, they're one and the same. You do one, you end up doing the other. Like when he refused to, without looking this up, well, when he refused to get those soldiers and put them on trial during the time when Athens was taken over, when the state told him to stop doing philosophy, and he gave him that smart alecky remark in the apology. And it said, no, that I can't do that. That would be going against my ethics, which also goes against politics. And when I said in my bio that I love American philosophy, I believe American philosophy embodies this, especially when you go into Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Susan B. Anthony, and the list goes on. We're talking about workers' rights or women's rights or minority rights or whatever. You really can't talk about ethics without getting into the politics, and you can't talk about the politics without getting into the ethics. I think politicians, for better or for worse, and I think mostly for worse, are kind of our philosophers in action, kind of. The members of the House of Congress and the Senate and the presidency, and these are all, they're doing philosophy in a way that actually affects our lives. We're doing philosophy in a way that's, it's fun, and we're affecting the lives of our students, and we're hopefully enlightening minds. But, at the end of our classes, laws aren't made based on the things that we, but for Congress, they are. So I think if people don't see the connections immediately, hopefully after listening to this, they will, because you can't disconnect the political from the ethical, or it's really hard to do so. Really, really hard. Let's talk about something, like, how much should we charge for a driver's, or even that? Well, if we charge too much for a driver's license, are we disenfranchising a section of our community, right? I mean, even the most minute things, right? Should we put a stop sign on this corner? Well, we want to stop traffic deaths, but if we put a stop sign here, will we be doing some other things? So even the most minute political questions, I think could easily be tied up into an ethical dilemma, So yeah, it's really hard for me. It's hard for me to separate them. When someone says put them together, it's like, well, they're obviously together. It's like I can't see how I could pull them apart. That's the harder question.
So let's I want to follow up with this line of reasoning here for a second. We live in a very, I think this is a pretty non-controversial statement at this point, but we live in a very polarized political environment. And oftentimes when somebody mentions the study of politics, this is kind of equated with the liberal versus conservative distinction that kind of infiltrates every single conversation that we have in the United States.
Yeah.
So let's talk about political philosophy in general terms in that sense, because I think there might be some misunderstanding by people who listen to this, because in the same way that we mean something different in philosophy when we talk about ethics, in the sense that it's not just a matter of personal opinion, but that there are actually good arguments for and against some ethical ideas. We mean something different when we talk about politics, I think, in philosophy. So can you speak to that distinction, maybe the ways in which discourse in political philosophy differs from the discourse that you might encounter on Fox News or CNN or something along those lines?
Well, there's a quote, I believe this is attributed to Aristotle, who says it's the mark of an educated mind to entertain an idea without, agreeing with it necessarily, or 100%, or even at all. Not making yourself be cut off from certain ideas from the offset, based on whatever it might be, the authority figure telling you that these sort of ideas are, forbidden, whether it be socialism, or whether it be, on the other side of that, someone who's just racist, but, freedom of speech allows them certain leeways. I think how we do it in philosophy, though, is we seek to know what the political theories are, without sort of cutting ourselves off from knowing what they are based on, well, these particular ideas are, I don't even want to know them. I don't even want to know of them. Like, as a philosopher, I know a lot of theories. I only agree with a handful of them, but I know a lot of them, and that's part of my job, is to know them, to be able to retain that information and pass it on to other people. And so when you're doing political philosophy, we aren't really, at least at the beginning stages, you're not advocating for one thing over another, and you're not hiding from anything. You sort of expose yourself to it, learn about it, represent it fairly, and then we can tear it apart, and then we can put forth a better argument. But at the beginning stage, we're not. A lot of people think of it as, I'm a liberal, and so everything is from this liberal perspective. I'm a conservative, everything's from this conservative perspective. You're not even going to hear about these other people. They're, persona non grata or whatever. That's not how I think it is done or should be done in political philosophy. Now, when you get to those higher levels, we start talking about making arguments for for democracy over dictatorship, or for, this particular form of democracy over that particular form. And you make arguments for why one thing is better, maybe better is not even the best word, but more effective, or, more successful, or whatever. We can start making those arguments, but you got to have that ability to go big picture and not cut yourself off from certain things. As opposed to saying with Fox News, where obviously they're coming at it from one particular side. You're not even going to hear a fair representation of the other side. And then we do have, the mirror image of that might be, and it comes from a good place, but, saying this person needs to be deplatformed. This is hate speech. This is going to lead to violence. In some cases, that's absolutely right. In some cases, it might not be. I think the philosopher has to be careful about, cutting themselves off and censorship. And also, when we do make those arguments for one political system or political theory over another, there's an also responsibility there too. We have to make sure that we're being responsible there as well, that we're very careful about the arguments that we make, and that, that we're sure about them, that they're backed up through logic and research. So yeah, I think that's the difference between how philosophically we do political science versus how to do it in, the real world, the lay world, Fox News, the media. We're more open and we're more rigorous. And at least that's how I think we should be.
Yeah, I think that was very nicely explained. Do you see a connection between these large metaethical theories and certain types of political thought? If we're going to say they're connected, I guess, how are they connected? Where do you see that connection taking place? Is there a link between these metaethical theories and political theories?
I think so. Metaethics, if ethics are making the rules of what's right and what's wrong, metaethics is asking, is it even possible to make such rules? Or how do we make these rules? I mean, that's usually how I keep it in my head. Like, okay, on the ethical level, we're usually talking about what rules are good or bad, or what rules should we have. Then on the metaethical level, we're talking about, is it even possible to make these rules? And a big part of metaethics is that question. And then some people, their answer to that question is no. Every ethical theory is essentially a representation of someone's emotional state. It doesn't connect. Hume says something like this. I think it's called emotivism or something passionism or something, intuitionism or something. The ethical theory that all ethical theories are just expressions of human emotions. There's nothing grounding them. It's not written in the stars. Some people even say that without God, ethics is impossible and things like that. How is this reflected politically? If you take a nihilistic stance on ethics, say the idea that there really is no grounding for any ethical theory, you're much more likely to take a might makes right sort of mentality, a Machiavellian sort of, he might have gotten a bad rap people use that name like that. But that sort of idea that because there are no real grounding ethical, because on a meta-ethical level, ethics is impossible, and people doing it are just expressing their own subjective emotions. I'm not going to restrain myself to that. And so, if I can lie, cheat, and steal and rise politically, that's fine. If my country lies, cheats, and steals and abuses other countries, that's fine, because nihilism, because there is no real morality. And then and all the way down the line. I mean, if you take a sort of position of, I don't know, solidarity, human solidarity, trying to eliminate pain and promote happiness, then I think you would lead more towards a democracy. You would lean more towards universal rights. You would lean more towards protecting the least of you, or the minority, protecting the downtrodden. At this state in my life, I think that's where my arguments have led me. And I don't think this, I try not to think of it sentimentally. I try to think of it logically. But yeah, I do believe that your meta-ethical theory is going to be reflected in your political theory. Whether you're taking a sort of Marxist, you tell them, whether you're taking a sort of, whatever sort of approach you're taking is going to be reflected, whether it's a socialist or sort of Irandian egotism. You notice that the capitalists, they're always bringing their Atlas Shrugged, whereas the Antifa folks, whomever they are, whatever, the lefties, they're bringing their copy of Das Kapital or whatever, or the Communist Manifesto. The ethics is going to inform the political. And I think that from what I can tell, most of our politicians, they're reading Ayn Rand, or they're nihilists, or they're not reading the same stuff that I'm reading. They're not coming to the same conclusions that I'm coming to, apparently. Yeah, definitely. Your meta-ethical position is going to lead, just like I said before, it's harder for me to pull them apart than the connections to me seem so clear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. So, Darren, if somebody on the off chance watches this and is really interested in learning more about ethics and doesn't have the honor and privilege of taking one of your classes, where would you recommend that they start, or who would you recommend that they start with?
Wow, that's a really good question. If they're wanting to learn about ethics, well, one of the easiest places to start is to start within. Try to, even before I could easily say, get you like a good survey book, like a good intro book, and flip to the ethics section. It's not gonna go deep, but it's gonna go wide. You're gonna get like a blurb, a paragraph, at most a chapter, but you're gonna get like 10 different philosophers across 10 different traditions. Not gonna go too deep into any of them, but you'll get a taste. And doing something like that is worthwhile if you're interested in that. Of course, I would recommend Aristotle, Bentham and Mill. I lump them together, utilitarian, and Kant. Those would be like, so you want virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontological or Kantian ethics. But also just look within yourself as well. You're already walking around. It would be hard for me to imagine. So a lot of people think that philosophy is, in the ivory tower, and I'm just living on the streets. I'm not doing that. You are doing it, right? I mean, if you don't step into the middle of the street because you believe you'll get hit by a car, that's philosophy. It's logic. It's a lot of stuff. It's metaphysics. It's a lot of stuff wrapped into that. If you don't want to steal candy from a baby, or you do, and you already have that in your mind, you're already doing ethics. So I would look at your own personal ethics and try to justify them outside of authority and tradition. if it's done by tradition, then there might be a reason behind it. Try to discover that reason. If you believe that this was ordained by God and that God has perfect rationality, try to get yourself to recognize the rationality in it rather than just say only because of God. Not to say that you have to reject these ideas but try to justify them on their own merits, right? If God says don't do murder, why is that a good idea? And don't just say because God said it. Tell me the reasons why. This would be like a paper I give to a student. So yeah, I would say you can always start within your own self. The majority of a great chunk would probably have been to a church, and you've been at churches do philosophy. They do philosophy there. Churches is basically like philosophy for people who aren't in college at the time. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of layman's philosophy. They go in there, they're talking about metaphysics, they're talking about ethics, the two biggest pieces of philosophy for the layperson, life after death and things like that. So if you can't get you a philosophy book, there are some free resources online. Stanford Encyclopedia. Yeah. Only as a jumping off point. Wikipedia only as a jumping off point. Wikipedia is always your starting point. It's never your ending point. All right. If you're going to use it at all, it's always just a starting point, not the end point. Okay. It leaves you somewhere else, gives you an idea and takes you somewhere else. It has to. You can't let that be your end point. But yeah, jump on Wikipedia as your starting point. And then just follow your interests. If you're a philosopher, you're going to want to keep doing it. If you're a philosopher, it's going to be fun. You're going to want to keep doing it. If it doesn't feel fun, don't worry. Society's still going to sneak it in there. When you watch your Marvel movie, you're going to get a little bit of it. Through Thanos. When you read your comic books, you're going to get a little bit of it. So it's going to be harder to escape and avoid than it is to seek it out. But yeah, just start with that. Without getting into how to pirate stuff, I have to kind of stop there. But yeah, try to get that information. Just go to your local library. Having fun isn't hard when you have a library card. So your local library.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it, Darren. Thanks for joining me. I really value your insights there. That was really great. Thank you.
I'll see you again.
Yes, absolutely.